Deep in the dense woods of Washington State, a small, isolated cabin stood as the perfect getaway. Sam and his friends, restless after months of office routines, had found it online and rented it for a long weekend. The cabin had no Wi-Fi, no cell service, and no nearby neighbors, perfect for the escape they wanted. Or so they thought. The first night started with stories by the fire. But as laughter faded and the fire died down, the reality of their surroundings set in. The woods around them stretched endlessly, silent, except for the occasional crack of a branch or the distant rustle of leaves. Shadows seemed to shift under the trees, moving in eerie, unnatural ways. In the dead of night, Sam awoke suddenly, feeling as if someone was staring at him. He scanned the room and saw nothing but his friends asleep in their beds. He was almost ready to laugh off his fear when a faint tapping came from outside the window. Sam held his breath, staring at the dark glass, but the tapping stopped. Convinced it was a stray branch, he turned over and forced himself back to sleep. The next day, strange things started happening. The door, locked at night, was open in the morning, as if someone had left it ajar. Their food supplies, which they'd carefully packed away, were scattered across the kitchen floor. At first, they laughed it off, blaming a raccoon or a stray animal. But tension grew. Then they found footprints, human footprints, in the dirt around the cabin, fresh in the morning dew, despite seeing no one else for miles. That night, Sam couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. As he lay in bed, he heard soft footsteps outside, circling the cabin. Each creak of the wooden floor, each gust of wind seemed to carry a dark, chilling presence. He sat up, straining his ears, when suddenly he saw movement out of the corner of his eye. There, through the window, was a face. A pale, thin face, with hollow eyes staring directly at him. Sam froze, his heart racing. The figure didn't move, only stared, and he could feel its icy gaze drilling into him. His breath caught in his throat as he realized it wasn't looking at him, but past him. Turning slowly, he saw the others in bed, unaware. When he looked back, the figure was gone, leaving only darkness and the echoes of his racing heartbeat. The following morning, Sam woke up first and hurried outside to check for footprints. There were none. His friends shrugged off his concerns, teasing him about nightmares, but Sam couldn't shake the feeling. That evening, he didn't join them at the fire, preferring to sit inside with a view of every door and window. He was determined to stay awake to catch whoever or whatever was stalking them. As midnight neared, the atmosphere shifted. A heavy, oppressive silence blanketed the cabin. Then, a whisper echoed, barely audible but sinister, scratching at the edge of his hearing. He couldn't make out the words, but it sounded close, like it was coming from the walls. He whispered to his friends, urging them to listen, but they heard nothing. It wasn't until he saw the scratch marks that the real fear took hold. The wooden door, sturdy and locked, now had claw-like gouges, deep and ragged, as if something had tried to force its way in. They all stared, speechless, realizing this was no prank, no animal. It was something else, something determined, and now inside. That night, they all stayed awake, each person clutching a flashlight and a makeshift weapon. The hours crept by slowly. Every small noise, every gust of wind seemed to taunt them. And then came the scream, high-pitched and agonizing, shattering the silence. It was close, too close. The scream seemed to echo from inside the walls, filling the cabin with an icy dread that made each person's skin crawl. They bolted for the door, only to find it wouldn't open, no matter how hard they pulled. A scratching sound came from the walls, loud and frantic, moving from one side of the cabin to the other, as if something or someone was trapped within the very wood of the cabin itself. Panicked, they began to search for anything, a window, a loose board, to break free. But as they fumbled, the scratching grew louder, more desperate. Suddenly, the lights flickered and died, plunging them into absolute darkness. In that silence, they heard a whisper, "You're not alone." A shiver ran down their spines. As they struggled to adjust their eyes to the dark, they saw shadows stretching across the floor, moving toward them. Faces began to emerge, ghostly figures watching them from every corner, pale and twisted, their eyes hollow and black. The friends huddled together, frozen in terror, until the figures began to move closer, reaching out with cold, skeletal hands. Finally, with a desperate shove, Sam managed to break through a window, pulling his friends through as they bolted into the night. They ran, hearts pounding, lungs burning, hearing whispers and footsteps behind them the whole way. When they finally reached the main road at dawn, they were exhausted and shaking, but alive. They never spoke about that night again, and none of them ever returned to that cabin. But on quiet nights, when the wind blows just right, Sam sometimes hears a faint whisper, feels an icy chill, and remembers the terror of those hollow eyes watching him, waiting, lurking somewhere out there in the darkness. On a late October night, Emily was driving along a desolate country road on her way back from a friend's Halloween party. Her GPS led her through a series of twisting, dark roads she didn't recognize, taking her further and further from any sign of life. Shadows from thick trees lined the road, and the fog seemed almost unnatural, pressing in on her from all sides. Finally, her GPS lost signal altogether, and she was forced to rely on her instincts to find her way out. As she continued, she noticed something strange. An old wooden sign on the side of the road, partially hidden by overgrown weeds. Painted in faded, flaking letters, it read, "Welcome to Ashwood." She didn't remember seeing a town on the map. Ashwood? She glanced at her phone, but it was completely dead. Up ahead, she spotted lights, dim and flickering, like street lamps swaying in a ghostly breeze. Relieved at the sight of civilization, she turned onto the main road, hoping to find directions back to the highway. Ashwood was not like any town she'd ever seen. The houses were old, most of them boarded up, with peeling paint and broken windows. There wasn't a single person in sight, not a car or a hint of movement. But strange decorations adorned every house. Ragged scarecrows, skeletal dolls, and masks with faces twisted in horrified expressions. It looked more like a haunted house than a town. Ignoring the uneasy feeling clawing at her chest, Emily parked her car and stepped out, hoping to find someone who could give her directions. She walked up to the nearest house, an old Victorian with an eerie porch swing that creaked in the wind. As she knocked, she noticed a strange symbol scratched into the wood above the door, an eye surrounded by jagged lines. She knocked again, louder this time, but no one answered. Turning away, she was about to leave when she saw something strange. Across the street, a figure stood in the dim light. They wore a tattered coat and had their back to her, but their posture was wrong, hunched and tense, as if they were hiding something. A chill ran down her spine. "Excuse me?" she called out. "Can you help me? I'm trying to find my way back to the highway." The figure didn't move. Instead, a soft humming filled the air, low and uneven, like an eerie lullaby. Emily took a cautious step back, heart pounding. As she moved, the figure turned its head just enough for her to catch a glimpse of its face, only it wasn't a face at all. The figure wore a mask, one of the twisted, horrified expressions she'd seen on the other decorations. But this one wasn't hanging on a house, it was looking directly at her. Without thinking, Emily backed up and ran to her car. She fumbled for her keys, her hands trembling. But just as she turned the ignition, her headlights illuminated something even more horrifying. Figures, dozens of them, were emerging from the shadows. Each wore a mask, each with a different expression, some laughing, some crying, some wide-eyed in terror. And every one of them was moving toward her, their movements slow and jerky, like broken puppets. Panic surged as she hit the gas, swerving down the street to escape. But no matter which direction she turned, the road twisted back toward the town center. The fog had thickened, and the lights of Ashwood glowed like dim embers, casting distorted shadows across the empty streets. Finally, she spotted a small building at the edge of town that seemed to have its lights on. Desperate, she parked, sprinted up the steps, and burst through the door. It was a small shop, lined with dusty shelves and old photographs of the town. An elderly man sat behind the counter, his eyes vacant, as if he hadn't seen a soul in years. "Please," Emily gasped. "You have to help me. I need to get out of here." The man slowly looked up, his gaze unsettlingly calm. He tilted his head, studying her with a sad smile. "You shouldn't have come here," he said in a voice barely above a whisper. "Ashwood is not for visitors." "What do you mean? I didn't know. I just got lost." The man nodded slowly, as if he'd heard the same story before. "They come for the lost," he murmured. "Those who wander here are never meant to leave." The door creaked open behind her, and she turned to see the masked figures standing motionless in the doorway. Each of them was watching her, their masked faces shifting and twitching as if alive. Emily backed away, bumping into a shelf, knocking over a glass jar that shattered on the floor. The man sighed. "They have chosen you. Once the mask is worn, you belong to Ashwood." Emily's skin prickled with cold terror as he held out a mask identical to the ones the others wore. She shook her head, backing away, but the masked figures inched closer, reaching out to her with gloved, trembling hands. "No," she whispered, but it was useless. The man's voice was calm, almost soothing. "Embrace your place, and Ashwood will embrace you in return." Before she could scream, the figures were upon her, their hands gripping her arms, their hollow, unseeing eyes consuming her as she was pulled into the crowd, the mask forced onto her face. Years passed, and the town remained as empty and eerie as ever. Some say that on cold, foggy nights, if you wander too far from the road, you might just stumble into Ashwood. And if you do, beware the silent figures with twisted, frozen faces, watching, waiting, ready to welcome you into their endless, haunted embrace. Mara had been living alone for almost a year now, after inheriting her grandmother's old farmhouse on the outskirts of town. It was an old, creaky place, but she loved the quiet and the sense of history embedded in the walls. Her grandmother had always been a quiet, serious woman, with a strange habit of never allowing anyone to go into the basement. Now that Mara had the place to herself, she was tempted to see what lay down there. But she hesitated, somehow feeling her grandmother's warnings even now. One night, after a long day, Mara fell asleep in the living room, only to be awakened by a strange noise. A faint shuffling sound was coming from the floor beneath her. She sat up, heart pounding, listening closely. The noise was soft, like something scraping against the walls down in the basement. She dismissed it as an old house settling, a raccoon maybe, but a feeling of unease settled into her bones. The next morning, Mara searched every corner of the house for signs of animals, but found nothing. That night, the shuffling noise returned, louder this time. It sounded closer, as though it were moving just beneath the floorboards. She stood in the hallway, trying to place the sound, her heart racing as it seemed to follow her. It was no animal. It was something deliberate, something human. Unable to ignore it any longer, she grabbed a flashlight and made her way to the basement door. She felt an eerie chill as she stood there, hand on the doorknob. She steeled herself, feeling foolish for being afraid in her own home, and swung the door open. The basement steps stretched down into darkness, the smell of old wood and damp earth filling her senses. Slowly she descended, her footsteps echoing on the creaky wooden stairs. Her flashlight beam trembled as she swept it across the basement, revealing stacks of boxes, dusty furniture, and a few old tools. Everything seemed normal, abandoned, quiet. But then she noticed something odd. In the far corner, there was a small, old wooden door she'd never seen before. It was almost hidden by stacks of old newspapers and a pile of her grandmother's belongings. Hesitating, Mara approached the door, feeling an intense urge to turn back, but she was compelled to know what lay beyond. She pushed the door open, her flashlight illuminating a narrow, cramped hallway that stretched deeper underground. The walls were lined with faded, peeling wallpaper, and there was a strange smell, musty, but with an undertone of something foul, like rotting meat. She took a step forward, then another, her pulse pounding louder with each step. The hall twisted and turned in strange ways, seeming to lead her further and further from the basement she thought she knew. Finally, she reached the end, where a small, dimly lit room awaited. In the middle of the room was an old wooden chair, and tied to it was something that stopped Mara's heart. A figure sat slumped in the chair, its head lolled to the side, dressed in a ragged nightgown. With a wave of horror, Mara realized that the figure looked just like her grandmother. The face was sunken and lifeless, skin pulled tight against the bones, but unmistakable. Mara stumbled back, her flashlight dropping to the ground. In the dim light, she noticed something even stranger. Another door stood behind the figure, and it was slightly ajar. The faint sound of whispering drifted from the other side, growing louder as if noticing her presence. The whispers were rapid and frantic, too many voices speaking at once, filling her ears and crowding her mind. Frozen in terror, Mara barely registered as the figure in the chair began to shift, lifting its head slowly, eyes empty but somehow aware. The figure's mouth opened, releasing a soft, rasping voice. "Why did you come down here?" It whispered, the voice an echo of her grandmother's but warped, hollow. Mara scrambled back, heart racing, but the whispers grew louder, and with a sickening twist of dread, she realized they were coming from behind the walls, from the very structure of the house itself. The walls seemed to pulse and breathe, as if alive, closing in on her with each heartbeat. Panicking, she turned and bolted back down the narrow hallway, her flashlight swinging wildly, casting shadows that seemed to reach out for her. The whispers followed her, growing louder, relentless, until they coalesced into a single, clear voice, deep and inhuman. "You're one of us now." Mara reached the basement stairs, breathing heavily, the weight of an unseen presence pressing on her back. She slammed the basement door shut behind her, locking it and backing away. Yet she could still hear the whispers, muffled but present, a faint scratching sound now echoing through the walls of the house. That night she lay in bed, eyes wide open, heart racing with every creak of the old house. She was afraid to close her eyes, afraid that if she fell asleep, she would wake up in that basement, strapped to the chair, another lifeless figure in the endless shadows. Days passed, but the house felt different, darker, more oppressive. The whispers never truly stopped, and Mara could sense something watching her from every corner, from behind every door. She tried to leave, to run, but every road out seemed to loop back to the farmhouse no matter how far she drove. It was as if the house had trapped her, refusing to let her escape. And then one night, as she sat in her room, the lights flickering, she heard the basement door creak open on its own. She froze, knowing she hadn't touched it, that no one else was there. The whispers grew louder, filling the air around her, pressing into her mind, pulling her toward the basement, guiding her back down to where she belonged. When they finally found the farmhouse, months later, it was empty. There was no sign of Mara, only her belongings left undisturbed, as if she had simply vanished. But the townspeople knew better. They'd heard rumors of the house, of its dark, hidden history. Some nights, if you stand outside the farmhouse, you can hear faint whispers floating up from the basement, voices pleading, calling, begging for escape. And if you're unlucky enough to wander inside, you might just find yourself drawn to the basement, where they say Mara still sits, her eyes hollow, watching, waiting for someone new to join her in the endless, haunted silence. In a small, mist-shrouded town, a forest loomed just beyond the edge, thick and ancient. Locals spoke in hushed tones about the woods, saying that people who ventured too deep sometimes didn't return. But for years, Ivy dismissed these tales as folklore. That was until her best friend Mark went missing. Mark had always been fascinated by the mysteries of the forest, frequently hiking in its secluded trails. One crisp autumn day, he texted Ivy, saying he'd found something strange and incredible in the woods, something he wanted to show her. That was the last she heard from him. Days passed with no sign of Mark, and a search team was sent into the forest, combing through trees and undergrowth, but they found nothing. Ivy felt an unease growing inside her, as if the woods themselves had swallowed him whole. Determined to find answers, she packed a small bag, grabbed her flashlight, and decided to go into the forest herself. As she crossed the threshold of trees, an immediate chill wrapped around her. The air was dense, the sounds of birds and insects oddly absent. Leaves crunched under her boots, and the further she walked, the more she noticed how strange the forest felt, as if it were watching her. After an hour of hiking, Ivy came across something that sent a shiver down her spine. Tied to a tree was a small, ragged doll, crudely made from sticks and cloth, with dark beads for eyes. It stared at her, expressionless, and seemed oddly familiar, as if it were waiting for her. She tried to ignore it, pushing forward, but soon she saw another doll, and then another, hanging from branches or tucked among the roots, each one staring with hollow eyes. Then she found the first piece of evidence that Mark had been there, a single hiking boot half buried in the leaves. Her heart raced as she picked it up, recognizing it instantly. Mark's. She called his name, her voice swallowed by the oppressive silence, but there was no answer. Desperation mounting, she pressed deeper, feeling as if she were being led somewhere. The trees grew closer, thicker, their branches twisting above her like skeletal fingers. After what felt like hours, she stumbled into a small clearing where an ancient, weathered cabin stood, shrouded in mist. The cabin looked out of place, its walls covered in moss, with a broken window that stared at her like a dead eye. She approached slowly, feeling her heart hammering in her chest. When she reached the door, she noticed something scratched into the wood. Symbols and markings she didn't recognize. Symbols that felt wrong, as if they pulsed with a dark energy. Swallowing her fear, Ivy pushed open the door, stepping into the stale, dark interior. Inside, the smell of rot and damp wood filled her nose. The walls were covered in old, tattered photos and drawings, each one a face. Dozens, maybe hundreds of faces, all staring out from the paper with blank, empty expressions. Ivy moved her flashlight across the room, her eyes catching on something lying on the floor in the far corner. Mark's backpack. She rushed to it, opening the flap and finding his phone and notebook. But just as she grabbed it, she heard something, a faint scratching sound like nails dragging against wood. She froze, holding her breath. The scratching grew louder, coming from the back of the cabin, from a door that seemed to lead underground. Compelled by equal parts fear and curiosity, Ivy approached the door, each step heavier than the last. She pulled it open, revealing a narrow staircase that disappeared into darkness. The smell of decay was stronger here, seeping up from below. She hesitated, but something inside urged her on, an instinctual pull she couldn't explain. As she descended, the scratching grew louder, more frantic. The stairway was tight, pressing her in on all sides until she finally reached the bottom, where a single dim light bulb flickered overhead. The walls down here were covered in more of those symbols, painted in what looked like dried blood. And then, at the end of the hallway, she saw him. Mark, crouched in the corner, his back to her. His clothes were torn, his hair matted, and he was scratching at the wall, over and over, in slow, repetitive motions. Relief surged through her, and she called his name, but he didn't respond. He continued scratching, oblivious as if in a trance. She stepped closer, reaching out to touch his shoulder. As soon as her hand made contact, he froze, his head slowly turning to face her. Ivy recoiled, gasping. His face was gaunt, pale, his eyes wide but empty, filled with a darkness she couldn't comprehend. "Mark," she whispered. But it wasn't Mark's voice that responded. Instead, a deep, guttural voice echoed from his throat, a voice that was not human. "You should not have come here," it rasped, the voice crawling over her skin like ice. Suddenly, Mark's hand shot out, grabbing her wrist with an iron grip. His mouth twisted into a grotesque smile, his eyes staring blankly past her, as if something else was looking through him. "The forest claims its own," the voice continued, and she could feel a coldness creeping up her arm, spreading through her veins. Panicking, she wrenched free and stumbled back, turning to run up the stairs. But as she reached the top, she froze. The cabin wasn't empty anymore. Figures filled the room, shadowy, silent figures, their faces shrouded in darkness, each one staring at her with empty, hollow eyes. She bolted, shoving past them, her mind racing as she ran out of the cabin and back into the forest. But no matter which direction she went, the path twisted and turned, leading her back to that same clearing, back to the cabin that seemed to loom larger with each return. Desperate, she screamed, calling for help. But the forest absorbed her cries, swallowing her voice in its suffocating silence. The dolls hanging from the trees seemed to watch her, their eyes filled with a quiet, mocking pity. Finally, exhausted and defeated, Ivy found herself back at the cabin's door. The whispering started again, low and relentless, calling her name, inviting her in. With nowhere else to go, she stumbled inside. The figures were gone, but a strange calm washed over her as she sat down on the floor, feeling an emptiness settle within her. When the search party found the cabin weeks later, they discovered two things: Mark's backpack and Ivy's flashlight lying on the floor. There was no sign of either of them. No tracks, nothing. Only the dolls, scattered through the trees, staring down with those hollow, lifeless eyes. But some say that if you wander into those woods late at night, you might see two figures among the trees. A man and a woman, moving silently, aimlessly, their eyes dark and empty, as if they're searching for something they can't remember. And if you listen closely, you might hear a faint whisper, calling for help, echoing through the forest as it fades into the endless shadows. Elliot had never believed in ghosts, curses, or the supernatural. But when he inherited his great-aunt's antique shop in a quiet town by the coast, he started to feel an uneasy energy about the place. The shop was a cluttered maze of old relics, aged mirrors, dusty books, statues with chipped paint, and trinkets from every corner of the world. Most unsettling of all was an ancient mirror that hung on the back wall, framed in ornate, tarnished silver. The mirror was massive, nearly as tall as he was, and the surface was so darkened by age it barely reflected anything at all. Local legend held that the mirror was cursed, though no one could explain exactly why. His great-aunt had hung a thick velvet curtain over it and warned him never to remove it. But curiosity got the better of him one rainy evening when, alone in the quiet of the shop, he felt drawn to the old mirror. With a quiet defiance, he pulled the curtain aside. He stared at the cloudy, dim glass, unable to see anything but his vague silhouette. Just as he was about to turn away, something strange happened. The foggy glass began to clear, as if being wiped clean from the inside. Slowly, his reflection sharpened, but it didn't look quite like him. There was something different, something wrong with the eyes. They were darker, empty, and held a look of sorrow so deep it felt like a weight pressing down on his chest. He blinked, but the reflection didn't follow suit. Instead, it continued to stare, watching him, expressionless. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and his heart skipped a beat. He reached out, touching the mirror's cold surface, and instantly his reflection's hand met his, pressing from the inside of the glass. A chill shot up his spine, and he yanked his hand back, heart pounding. He pulled the curtain back over the mirror and stumbled away, laughing it off as his imagination running wild. But after that night, strange things began to happen in the shop. Items would move from their places overnight, no matter how carefully he arranged them. Sometimes he'd hear faint whispering, words he couldn't quite make out, echoing from somewhere in the back of the shop. And every time he passed by the mirror, even with the curtain drawn, he felt an intense, prickling sensation, as if something behind it was watching him. One night, he locked up the shop and went upstairs to his apartment, exhausted and uneasy. He tried to sleep, but a persistent noise echoed through the floorboards, the sound of footsteps shuffling around downstairs. He dismissed it as the old building settling, but soon the footsteps grew louder, deliberate. It sounded like someone pacing back and forth. Reluctantly, he grabbed his flashlight and crept downstairs. The shop was dark and silent, but he could still hear the faint scuffing sound, now coming from the direction of the mirror. Swallowing his fear, he approached it, pulling the curtain aside, feeling a terrible, heavy presence as he did so. The mirror's glass was no longer foggy, it was completely clear, reflecting the room behind him. Only there was something in the reflection that shouldn't have been there. A figure stood just behind him, blurry and indistinct, dressed in clothing from another era, its face pale and gaunt. Its hollow eyes met his, and in that instant he felt an overwhelming wave of sorrow, anger, and something else, something that wanted him to stay. Panicking, he whipped around, but there was no one there. He turned back to the mirror, only to see the figure standing even closer now, reaching out as if trying to grasp his shoulder. Its hand pressed against the glass from the inside, its expression twisted in desperate yearning. In a panic, Elliot backed away, trying to cover the mirror with the curtain. But the lights flickered again, and suddenly he felt a cold hand grip his shoulder, firm and unyielding. He spun around, heart racing, but the room was empty. In the days that followed, he began to lose track of time, finding himself staring into the mirror for hours on end. The figure became clearer each time, its features sharper, more familiar. Its hair, its clothes, its face. Each day, it looked more like him. And then, one evening, he noticed something that stopped his heart. His own reflection was gone. In the mirror, he could see only the figure, identical to him now, staring back with empty, haunted eyes. He touched his face, feeling real, but when he raised his hand to wave, the figure in the mirror didn't respond. It simply watched him, motionless, with a sadness so profound it felt like drowning. Frantic, he tried to leave the shop, to escape the mirror's pull, but the doors wouldn't budge. He was trapped, alone in the silence, as the lights flickered and the darkness grew deeper. In a final act of desperation, he grabbed a chair and hurled it at the mirror. The glass shattered, fragments scattering across the floor, each shard catching his reflection. 1,000 tiny versions of himself staring back with hollow, lifeless eyes. But as he looked down, he realized with a sense of dawning horror that the face in each shard wasn't his anymore. It was the face of the figure, the trapped soul in the mirror, finally freed, watching him with a look of pity and triumph. From the broken shards, the figure's voice echoed, a whisper filled with centuries of sorrow. "You should have left it alone. Now you belong here." Elliot felt an overwhelming darkness close in around him, and he looked up to see the shop, his life, fading into mist as the mirror's cursed pull claimed him. The shop was found empty the next morning, with the mirror mysteriously whole again, its surface as cloudy and dim as it had been for generations. Now, on misty nights, locals say they can sometimes see a face in that old dark mirror, a face that looks just like Elliot's, staring out with a look of sorrow and regret, his hand pressed against the glass, trapped for all eternity. And if you look long enough, they say, he might just try to reach out for you too. Growing up, Claire had often heard stories about the strange house on her street. It was a large Victorian home, beautifully preserved, but everyone in town said it was haunted. Some people claimed they had seen shadows moving in the windows at night. Others swore they'd heard whispering when they walked by. Claire dismissed the rumors as superstition until she turned 12 and met Mrs. Abernathy, the old woman who owned the house. Mrs. Abernathy was kind and welcoming, always dressed in long, flowing gowns that looked like they were from another time. She had pale blue eyes that seemed to peer right into your soul, and she spoke in a soft, almost musical tone. One autumn afternoon, Mrs. Abernathy invited Claire inside for tea. Claire hesitated, but finally agreed, curiosity getting the best of her. The house was even more impressive on the inside. Ornate wooden furniture, dimly lit chandeliers, and walls covered with framed portraits of unsmiling people, their eyes following her as she walked. Mrs. Abernathy led her into a cozy parlor where a fire crackled, and a silver tea set was arranged on a small table. They sat in silence, sipping tea, but Claire couldn't shake the feeling that someone else was watching them. After a while, Mrs. Abernathy leaned forward and looked Claire in the eye. "Have you ever wanted to live forever, my dear?" she asked, her voice soft, almost hypnotic. Claire laughed, feeling a little nervous. "I don't know. I guess everyone thinks about it sometimes." Mrs. Abernathy's face softened into a smile, but there was something cold in her eyes. "Well, be careful what you wish for." Claire visited Mrs. Abernathy regularly over the years. It became a routine. She would come over, they would talk about life, the world, and the mysteries of the past. Claire was fascinated by the stories Mrs. Abernathy told, tales of old families, secrets, and betrayals. As she grew older, she noticed that Mrs. Abernathy looked exactly the same as she had the day they first met. Her hair remained dark, her skin pale and smooth, untouched by time. One night, Claire couldn't sleep. The wind howled outside, rattling her windows, and she had an overwhelming urge to visit Mrs. Abernathy. She crept out of her house, tiptoed down the street, and slipped into the Victorian mansion. Inside it was silent and dark, with the air thick with dust and age. She called Mrs. Abernathy's name, but there was no answer. Wandering through the empty rooms, she felt like an intruder, disturbing something ancient and sacred. In the dim light, she noticed a door she had never seen before. It was slightly ajar, leading down to a staircase that vanished into the darkness. Ignoring the chill that crept up her spine, Claire descended the steps, her footsteps echoing in the narrow hallway. The basement was cold and damp, filled with the smell of earth and mildew. She shone her phone's flashlight around, her pulse quickening as she took in the surroundings. The walls were lined with shelves, and on each shelf sat an object. Small, delicate things that seemed out of place in the grim setting. A child's doll, a faded photograph, a rusted locket. But as she reached the end of the room, her light fell upon something that made her blood run cold. A collection of jars, each one containing a strange, murky liquid. Inside each jar was a single human-like face, twisted in expressions of horror and sadness, as if frozen in their last moments of life. They were impossibly small, yet eerily lifelike, and she couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching her. Panicking, she turned to leave, but as she did, she felt a presence behind her. She spun around to find Mrs. Abernathy standing in the shadows, her eyes darker than Claire had ever seen, a faint, unsettling smile on her lips. "I told you to be careful what you wish for, Claire," she said softly, her voice echoing off the walls. Claire stammered, trying to form words, but her throat felt tight, and a terrible realization washed over her. These jars, they weren't just strange artifacts. They were trophies, souls that Mrs. Abernathy had collected over the years, remnants of her visitors who had once wished for something more, something dangerous. Mrs. Abernathy stepped closer, her gaze intense. "You wanted to live forever, didn't you? And now, my dear, you will." Before Claire could react, Mrs. Abernathy raised her hand, and Claire felt an icy grip around her throat. The room spun as a cold darkness enveloped her, suffocating, pulling her down into an abyss. Her body felt weightless, and her vision blurred, fading until all she could see was Mrs. Abernathy's face. serene and timeless. When Claire opened her eyes, she was no longer in the basement. She was trapped in darkness, confined, her entire world reduced to a small glass jar. She couldn't move, couldn't speak, only watch, helpless, as her distorted reflection stared back at her. And in the years that followed, Mrs. Abernathy continued to welcome new visitors, offering them tea and timeless tales, each one leaving behind a small piece of themselves in her ever-growing collection. Now, when children pass by the old Victorian house, they sometimes swear they see faces in the windows, faces with haunted eyes, silently pleading, forever trapped in Mrs. Abernathy's twisted eternity. Lucas was a night shift janitor at an old hospital, the kind of place where the walls seemed to hold echoes of everything they'd ever witnessed. It was a quiet job, and most nights he spent his shifts alone, wandering the empty halls with nothing but the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant beeps from machines in rooms long vacated. The top floor was closed off entirely. No one went up there. They called it the silent ward, and Lucas never had to clean there. He didn't ask why. But one night, a new manager came in and told him he had to go up and do a sweep of the top floor. Something about a safety check. Reluctantly, Lucas took his keys and flashlight and rode the creaky elevator up, feeling his stomach twist in dread as the doors opened onto the silent ward. The air was thick and stale, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. He stepped out, his flashlight casting long shadows that danced over empty beds and faded curtains. Most rooms were empty, but as he walked further, he started noticing strange things. Notes scribbled on the walls, warnings written in faint chalk. Do not trust them. They come at night, and don't look in their eyes. Lucas's hands shook as he ran his light over the walls, feeling the unsettling weight of every word. Then, from somewhere down the hall, he heard a soft shuffling sound, like bare feet dragging along the floor. He froze, his heart pounding as he tried to convince himself it was just the old building settling. But the noise grew louder, and he could hear faint whispering, the sound of multiple voices murmuring just out of earshot. He edged down the corridor, peering into the rooms, his flashlight flickering every few steps. In one room, he saw a figure, a woman, sitting on the edge of a bed, her back to him. Her hair was matted, and her hospital gown hung loose on her frail frame. She rocked back and forth slowly, whispering something over and over. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone was pleading, desperate. "Ma'am?" he called, his voice barely more than a whisper. The woman stopped rocking and turned her head ever so slightly, but she didn't look at him directly. Instead, she kept her face angled downward, her hair obscuring her eyes. "They're coming for me," she whispered, her voice raspy and raw. "They always come at night." Chills ran down his spine, but before he could respond, she spoke again, this time in a voice that was oddly calm. "You shouldn't have come up here," she said. He took a step back, his instincts screaming at him to leave. But as he turned, he saw more figures standing in the doorways of the rooms. Patients, some with bandaged heads, others with empty eyes, all staring at him in silence. Their faces were expressionless, but there was something in their eyes, a darkness, an emptiness that seemed to reach out to him, pulling him in. Lucas backed down the hallway, feeling the weight of their stares. His flashlight flickered again, and for a brief second, the light went out completely. When it came back on, the patients were closer, standing just feet away, their heads tilted in unnatural angles, their eyes unblinking. He spun around and bolted down the corridor, desperate to get back to the elevator. But as he ran, the whispering grew louder, swelling into a chorus of voices, each one pleading, warning, or laughing softly. The lights overhead began to dim, flickering in sync with his racing heartbeat. He reached the elevator and slammed his hand against the button, praying it would arrive quickly. As he waited, he glanced over his shoulder and saw the figures standing at the end of the hall, watching him. One of them raised a hand and pointed directly at him, a twisted smile spreading across her face. The elevator doors opened with a chime, and he stumbled inside, frantically pressing the button to go down. As the doors closed, he caught a glimpse of the figures moving toward him, their bodies jerking and twitching as they shuffled closer. The elevator descended, and he let out a shaky breath, trying to calm his racing heart. But just as he thought he was safe, the elevator lights flickered and went out, plunging him into total darkness. The hum of the elevator faded, replaced by silence. Then he heard it, the whispering. Soft at first, but growing louder, filling the small space. He pressed himself against the wall, clutching his flashlight, but it wouldn't turn on. The voices were all around him now, overlapping, whispering his name, telling him he should never have come to the silent ward. Suddenly, a cold hand brushed against his arm, and he gasped, recoiling in terror. More hands reached out, invisible in the darkness, touching his shoulders, his face, his neck. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they were all he could hear, drowning out his thoughts, filling his mind with a cold, consuming fear. When the lights finally came back on, the elevator was empty. The doors opened onto the ground floor, and his flashlight lay on the floor, abandoned. The hospital staff searched for Lucas, but he was never found. Only his flashlight remained, flickering weakly, as if struggling to stay alive. Now, people say that if you're alone on the night shift and you take the elevator up to the top floor, you might hear soft whispering or see shadowy figures standing in the hallways, watching you with hollow eyes. And if you're unlucky, you might feel a cold hand reaching out, inviting you to join them in the silent ward. Years ago, Emma's small hometown was hit by a devastating storm that took out the power for days and flooded the outskirts, including a place everyone called the Old Mill. The structure had been abandoned for decades and had a long history of strange disappearances and accidents. People said it was cursed, that you could hear voices inside if you stood quietly enough. When the storm came, it was nearly swept away, but a part of it stubbornly clung to the shore, looming over the river, decayed but unyielding. Emma had grown up hearing the legends surrounding the old mill, but it was just that, a story to scare children. But one October evening, her friend Jack dared her to visit the mill. The autumn air was cold, and a low fog rolled over the river, creeping up to her ankles as they approached the mill's entrance. The place seemed larger in the dark, shadows stretching and pooling around the broken windows and rotting wood. Every instinct screamed at Emma to turn back, but Jack laughed, calling her a coward. With a brave face, she stepped inside, the scent of mildew and rotting wood filling her nose. Inside, the mill was worse than she'd imagined. The walls were damp, peeling, and covered in strange black stains. Rusted gears and old machinery lay scattered on the floor, casting strange shadows under the weak beams of their flashlights. Jack dared her to go upstairs, and despite her fear, she accepted, unwilling to back down. The stairway creaked with each step, the boards soft underfoot as if they might give way any second. They reached the upper floor, where an old storage area overlooked the darkened mill floor below. Suddenly, Emma heard a faint sound, like distant laughter, but high-pitched and distorted, echoing faintly off the walls. She whipped around looking at Jack, who shrugged it off, saying it was probably just the wind. But Emma's gut told her something was very wrong. Then they saw it, a figure, half hidden in shadow, standing at the far end of the room. It looked human, but there was something unnatural about the way it stood, almost like it was hunched forward, leaning on the wall for support. Its head was tilted at an odd angle, as if its neck was broken. And then it spoke, its voice hollow and warped, as if it were underwater. "Welcome back," it said, the words barely more than a whisper. Emma froze, her mind racing. She didn't recognize the voice, but it sounded familiar, like someone she knew long ago. Jack, trying to be brave, called out, "Who's there?" His voice wavered, but he forced a laugh. "We're just exploring, all right?" The figure didn't respond. Instead, it took a slow, dragging step forward, its bare feet scraping across the floor, leaving wet footprints in its wake. Emma felt a chill settle deep in her bones as the figure approached, its face still obscured by shadow. The closer it got, the more wrong it looked. The limbs too long, the eyes dark pits sunken and void of any humanity. Panicking, Emma grabbed Jack's arm, whispering that they should leave. But he seemed rooted to the spot, transfixed by the figure. As it came closer, she could finally make out its face, and her stomach dropped. It was the face of a girl who had gone missing from their town years ago. Her face twisted into an expression of pain and despair, her mouth stretched wide as if in a silent scream. "Help! Me," it whispered, but its eyes held something darker, something menacing. Emma pulled on Jack's arm, but he wouldn't move, his gaze locked onto the apparition as if hypnotized. The figure suddenly lunged forward, reaching out with cold, claw-like fingers that brushed against Jack's shoulder. He let out a strangled gasp, his eyes wide with terror, but he still couldn't move. It whispered something unintelligible in his ear, words that seemed to echo through the mill, bouncing off the walls and burrowing into Emma's mind. Finally, she broke free of her paralysis and pulled Jack with all her strength, dragging him toward the stairs. Behind them, the figure followed, each step a slow, shuffling drag, its empty eyes fixed on them. They stumbled down the stairs, nearly tripping over the broken boards, the laughter growing louder, distorted, almost mocking. As they reached the ground floor, Emma glanced back one last time and saw the figure standing at the top of the stairs, its face twisted into a grotesque smile, its mouth moving silently. She couldn't hear the words, but she could see the look in its eyes, a hunger, a need for them to stay. They burst out of the mill and into the cold night air, gasping for breath. Jack was shaking, barely able to speak. He looked back at the mill, his face pale, and whispered, "It said my name. It knew who I was." Emma didn't want to ask what else it had said, but Jack continued, his voice barely above a whisper. It said I'd be back, that it was waiting for me." The townspeople say that after that night, Jack was never the same. He was haunted, constantly looking over his shoulder as if he could still feel the figure's gaze on him. A few weeks later, he disappeared. They searched the town, the woods, everywhere, but he was never found. Emma couldn't shake the feeling that he'd gone back to the mill, compelled by that thing that had spoken his name. And now, when Emma walks by the old mill, she swears she can see two figures standing at the window, watching, waiting for someone else to enter. And if you listen closely on dark, quiet nights, you might hear faint laughter drifting from the mill, a laughter that sounds like two voices, welcoming their next visitor. Ben worked at a 24-hour gas station on the edge of a small, desolate town. The station was the last stop for miles, bordered by dense, untamed woods on one side and an empty highway on the other. On his shift, Ben saw all sorts of characters, truckers, night owls, and even a few wanderers who seemed to appear out of nowhere. But nothing ever prepared him for what he experienced one foggy November night. It was around 2 a.m., and Ben was alone, as usual, scrolling mindlessly on his phone when he saw a car pull up to the farthest pump. The car was old, so old it looked like something from another time, almost antique. The headlights were dim, but he could see a figure in the driver's seat, unmoving. A chill swept through the station as he watched, feeling an unnatural urge to look away. After a minute or so, the figure finally got out. It was a man, dressed in old-fashioned clothes, a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his face. He walked toward the station with an unsettlingly slow gait, his footsteps almost too quiet on the gravel. Ben forced himself to smile, telling himself it was just another late-night customer. "Can I help you?" he asked as the man entered, the bell on the door giving a soft chime. The man didn't respond at first, his face shadowed beneath the hat. Then he lifted his head just enough for Ben to catch a glimpse of his eyes, dark and hollow, with no hint of light or life in them. He felt a sudden wave of nausea, like a bad dream creeping into reality. The man finally spoke, his voice raspy and low. "Need gas?" Ben nodded, his throat dry. Pump 1 is ready to go. Do you need anything else?" The man shook his head and, without another word, turned and walked back out to his car. Ben watched him pump gas, feeling an inexplicable dread. The man never looked up, never seemed to notice anything around him, just staring blankly as he filled the tank. When he was finished, he replaced the nozzle and got back into his car. Ben waited for him to come back to the station to pay, but the man just sat there motionless, his face barely visible through the fogged window. After a few minutes, Ben went outside, his heart pounding as he approached the car. He tapped on the window, calling out, "Sir, you need to come inside to pay." The man turned his head slowly, meeting Ben's gaze through the glass, and then he smiled. A slow, unsettling grin that seemed to stretch too far, revealing teeth that were sharp and unnaturally white. The headlights of a passing truck briefly illuminated the car, and in that flash of light, Ben could swear he saw something moving in the back seat. Something dark and shifting, almost like a shadow but alive, with long, claw-like fingers reaching toward the man. Panicking, Ben stumbled backward, nearly tripping over his own feet. The man's smile faded, and without another word, he turned the ignition and drove off into the night, leaving Ben standing alone in the cold. The car disappeared down the road, and Ben shook his head, trying to convince himself it was just exhaustion playing tricks on him. But as he walked back to the station, he noticed something on the ground by the pump, a small weathered photo. He picked it up, his hands trembling as he studied the image. It was a black and white photo of a family from decades ago. The man from the car was there, standing behind a woman and two children, his face twisted in that same unnatural grin. But it was the eyes of the family that sent chills down his spine. They were hollow, empty, and staring straight at him. As Ben stood there, the air grew colder, and he heard a faint whisper, almost too soft to make out. He held his breath, listening, straining to hear. "Help us," the voices murmured, overlapping, desperate. "He's coming. Don't let him take you too." Ben dropped the photo, his heart pounding as he ran back into the station, slamming the door shut behind him. He could still hear the faint echo of their pleas in his mind, and he spent the rest of his shift glancing at the road, half expecting to see the car returning, those empty dark eyes watching him from the shadows. The next morning, Ben told his boss about the strange encounter and the photo he'd found. His boss just shook his head, a dark look crossing his face. "You're not the first to see him," he said quietly, "and you won't be the last." Ben quit the job a few days later, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something from that night stayed with him, lurking in the corners of his vision, watching and waiting. And sometimes, on foggy nights, he'd wake up to the faint sound of gravel crunching outside his window, the low hum of an engine, and a shadowy figure standing just out of sight, smiling with those empty, soulless eyes, waiting for him to answer its silent call. As a night guard, Tom had worked at the Grayson Museum for years, patrolling its grand halls filled with ancient artifacts and strange, sometimes eerie sculptures. He was used to the quiet isolation of his job, the dim lights casting eerie shadows over the exhibits. But there was one room he dreaded, the East Wing, where they kept the statue of the Watcher. The statue was an old one, carved from a dark, almost black stone, with eyes that seemed to follow you no matter where you stood. It was taller than a man, with long, spindly fingers and a twisted, unnatural smile that made Tom's skin crawl. The plaque beneath it simply read, "The Watcher, Origin Unknown." Rumor had it that the statue had been found in an abandoned village, standing alone in a field with no signs of the civilization that had supposedly created it. They'd shipped it across the world to be displayed in the Grayson Museum, but the stories that followed it were unsettling. Some said it had a curse, that whoever stared at it for too long would be haunted by shadows, strange whispers, or worse. Tom wasn't superstitious, but he couldn't deny that every time he passed the statue, he felt its eyes drilling into him, as if it knew him, as if it were waiting. One stormy night, the power went out in the museum. Tom switched on his flashlight, its beam barely enough to pierce the shadows. The museum was even more eerie in total darkness, with strange shapes looming in every corner. As he made his rounds, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. When he reached the East Wing, he hesitated. The Watcher's shadow stretched across the wall, longer and darker than it should have been. Tom felt an icy chill run down his spine, but he forced himself to step closer, hoping the power would come back on soon. He shone his flashlight on the statue, feeling his heart hammering as its blank, dark eyes seemed to stare straight into his soul. Then he noticed something strange. One of the statue's hands was pointing toward him. He'd been certain that both hands were folded in front of it before, but now, unmistakably, one of the long, thin fingers was raised, as if beckoning him closer. Tom felt rooted to the spot, unable to tear his gaze away. It was absurd. Statues couldn't move. He must have been imagining it. A faint sound echoed down the hall, like a whisper, soft but persistent. He strained to listen, trying to make out the words, but all he could hear was a low, distorted hum, like a distant voice calling his name. He stepped back, his pulse racing, only to stumble over something on the floor, a dark, wet trail that led from the statue down the hallway, as if something had been dragged through the museum. His flashlight beam followed the trail, his heart sinking as it disappeared into the shadows of the next room. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to follow it, his steps echoing in the silent halls. He felt the air grow colder as he reached the doorway, a creeping sense of dread overtaking him. The trail led to a display case that housed an ancient mirror, cracked and tarnished with age. Tom raised his flashlight, and his blood ran cold when he saw his reflection, or rather, what was supposed to be his reflection. In the mirror, he saw himself, but his face was twisted, his eyes hollow, empty. A shadowy figure stood behind him, tall and looming, with long fingers resting on his shoulders. It was the Watcher. Frozen in horror, Tom watched as his reflection turned its head slowly, staring at him with dark, vacant eyes. The shadowy figure behind him leaned down, whispering something into his ear. He couldn't hear the words, but he felt them echo in his mind, filling him with a cold, consuming terror. He stumbled back, gasping for air, his flashlight flickering. He turned and ran, desperate to put as much distance as he could between himself and the statue. But as he reached the entrance, he heard footsteps behind him, slow, deliberate, echoing through the empty halls. Tom glanced over his shoulder and saw it. The statue moving toward him, its head tilted, that twisted smile growing wider, its long fingers reaching out. His heart pounded as he sprinted for the exit, his flashlight clattering to the ground as he fumbled for his keys. Just as he reached the door, he felt a cold hand on his shoulder, freezing him in place. He turned slowly, his breath catching as he looked up into those dark, endless eyes. The statue's smile grew wider, impossibly wide, and he heard it whisper one final word, a promise that filled him with dread. Soon. Tom burst through the doors, stumbling into the rain-soaked night, gasping for breath. He quit the next morning, but he was never the same. He couldn't sleep, couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. He moved to a different town, tried to forget about that night. But every now and then, he'd catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of his eye. A tall, dark figure with hollow eyes and a twisted smile, always just beyond the edge of his vision, always waiting, always watching. There's a town hidden deep within the woods called Black Hollow, a place no longer marked on maps. It's said that once you enter, it's nearly impossible to leave. The town itself looks like it's stuck in time, with gas lamps lining the streets and faded houses that look frozen in the 1800s. Local legend claims that Black Hollow only appears to travelers who are lost, tired, or seeking something that can't be found. Tom, an experienced hiker, was on a solo trip when he lost his way one evening. He wandered for hours, the trees pressing in tighter and tighter until he spotted lights through the fog. Relieved to see signs of civilization, he walked toward them, finding himself in a strange, deserted town. The air was heavy, muffling every sound but his own footsteps as he looked around at the rows of old, crumbling houses. Despite the eerie quiet, he noticed an inn with a flickering sign reading, "The Hollow Haven." The door was unlocked, and Tom hesitated, feeling an urge to leave, but curiosity got the better of him. Inside, the inn was dimly lit, with a single woman standing behind the counter. She wore an old-fashioned dress, her face pale, eyes almost too dark. She greeted him with a hollow smile. "Welcome," she said. "You must be tired. A room is waiting for you." Something about her voice felt wrong, like it was echoing from somewhere far away. Tom shook off the feeling, attributing it to exhaustion, and asked for directions out of town. But the woman only smiled and repeated, "A room is waiting for you." Unnerved, Tom accepted, figuring he'd just rest a bit and leave at dawn. She handed him an iron key and pointed to the second floor, her eyes never leaving his. When he climbed the stairs, he found a single hallway lined with rooms, each door closed tightly. His room was at the very end. As he entered, the heavy smell of dust and mold filled his nose. The room was sparse, a single bed, an old mirror, and a window overlooking the quiet street below. Just as he was about to sit down, he noticed something strange. In the reflection of the mirror, the hallway behind him was visible, but a dark figure stood there, staring at his door. He whipped around, but the hallway was empty. An uneasy feeling crept over him. He glanced back at the mirror, and now the figure was closer, standing just a few feet from his door. It was tall, shadowy, with a face he couldn't quite see. His heart pounded as he turned back to the door, locking it quickly, then backed away, not daring to take his eyes off the hallway's reflection. He tried to convince himself it was just his mind playing tricks, but then he heard it. Faint footsteps in the hallway, slowly moving closer. The doorknob rattled, and a whisper seeped through the crack in the door, almost like a breeze. Tom. Cold panic washed over him as he realized it knew his name. He stared at the mirror, watching the shadow press itself against the door, its face a distorted, twisted smile, eyes too wide, too dark, like pits leading into nothingness. It whispered again, louder this time, more insistent. "Come join us, Tom." Without thinking, he grabbed his things, backing away from the door. He was too terrified to look away from the mirror, watching as more figures appeared in the hallway. their faces warped, grinning as they whispered his name, calling him. They pressed their hands to the door, their fingers leaving dark, wet smudges that seemed to ooze through the wood. Panicking, Tom opened the window, hoping for an escape. He climbed onto the ledge, the cold night air filling his lungs. As he looked down, though, his heart sank. The ground was gone. Below was a swirling darkness, something deeper and more endless than night. The figures whispered his name again, their voices growing louder, filling his mind with a sense of dread so deep it paralyzed him. He turned back to the room and saw that the door was now open, the figures standing just inside, grinning, their hollow eyes locked on him. There was no escape. He heard a final whisper, soft yet echoing inside his head. "You belong here now, Tom. Black Hollow never lets anyone go." With nowhere left to run, he closed his eyes and leapt, hoping for something, anything, but only felt a cold, endless pull dragging him down, down into the depths. The next morning, hikers passing through the woods found an old, weathered sign half buried beneath the undergrowth. "Welcome to Black Hollow. Population lost."